Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Scar and I'm a part-time illustrator who mainly does art studio vlogs, but today I wanted to walk you guys through my ink drawing process. Hopefully this can give you some tips and tricks on how to use ink in your own artwork, or maybe just serve as some background noise while you do your own thing. Either way, I hope you enjoy and feel free to comment any questions you might have below. While I normally work with ink in my mixed media sketchbook, for this video I wanted to work a bit larger, and I ended up using a 9x12 cold pressed watercolor paper from Arteza. Cold pressed has a really nice texture to it, unlike hot pressed paper, but it doesn't affect the painting process in any way. It's mostly like an aesthetic preference and kind of what visual style you want to end up with or prefer working with. And a quick side note, while Arteza has sent me free product in the past to review, they are not sponsoring this video. They have not asked me to make this video, so I just genuinely like their watercolor paper and I feel like it's a pretty affordable brand, so I thought I would share. I will also try and link any of the art supplies that I use in this video below in the description in case you guys are interested, but none of those links will be affiliate links. I started this project by attaching the paper to a drawing board with some washi tape, and unfortunately the one I chose was not very sticky as I wanted it to be, but it worked well enough, and you don't really need it to be super sticky because you risk the paper tearing when you peel it back up. You also don't have to use washi tape. You can use masking tape, or there's also a paper tape where you wet it and then apply it to watercolor paper, but this is just what I have on hand, so that's what I'm going to be using. By adding tape to the edges of the paper, it can help it keep from warping or wrinkling when you add ink to it, or watercolor if you want to use watercolors. And it's a good trick if you plan on painting up to the edges of your page, but you want to keep like a border around your drawing. But it's also not a necessary thing if you don't have the option or want to. For the sketching process, I usually grab a light colored pencil in something that will match the hue of the ink that I'm using, or something adjacent so it hides well underneath that ink. Since I'm using red today, I'm going to go for an orange and red colored pencil to build the initial sketch. The light orange pencil that I chose doesn't show up very well on the camera, but it worked well to really make those broad marks something gestural just to get the basic shapes and create that layout of the piece. By starting light, you can make any needed changes to the composition of the piece a lot easier, and from there you can have a good concept of where things are going to go on the page, the size, the proportion, and like how they relate to each other in that space. You can go in with a slightly darker shade and add more refined lines and details later. Building from the ground up like this can be really helpful with unfamiliar subjects or complicated layouts, but I would still recommend stepping back from your project at multiple points during the sketching stage to make sure that the composition feels right to you, and if you're using a reference photo, to make sure that it's accurate to that photo. Pay attention to how much negative space there is, how the size or the shape of things leads your eye through the drawing. The way you place things on the page can affect how balanced that piece looks, and it's a lot easier to change or rearrange during this stage rather than looking at it after you start inking and realizing that it kind of looks strange or off. In the next step, we start the inking process. I like to use a small plastic palette for this with multiple wells, so that way I can adjust the opacity and the strength of the ink. But for this first part, I'm just going to use the ink as it is straight out of the bottle and create the line work first. This acrylic ink that I'm using has some transparency to it even when you aren't watering it down, so some of the lines I went over a few times to build up the color and the coverage. Whether you want to start with shading or the lines first is completely up to your own art style and preferences, but I personally find it a lot easier to do the line work first and then add shading later. It gives a good guideline as to where that shading should go. For the line work, I don't usually worry about any mistakes I might make in the thickness of lines or placement, because I find that shading helps detract from any of the weirdness that might happen, and realistically, no one is looking at it as closely as you are. I also wouldn't focus on trying to make the lines perfect in regards to matching your sketch lines, because once the ink dries, you can easily erase whatever pencil marks still show. Another suggestion I would make is to turn your artboard around as you're working on it, not only to prevent the ink from smudging on your hand, but also to work with the natural movements that your hand wants to make. I wouldn't try and fight against what your hand naturally wants to do. It makes it a lot harder to make a clean line, and if you're working with the movement rather, it makes it a lot easier on your wrist and a lot easier to maintain that smooth and consistent line work. Moving on to the shading portion, I would recommend having a scrap piece of paper, preferably the same type of paper that you're making your art on, so you can test swatch the watered down inks you prepare. It's kind of hard to tell when you're just looking at it in the well of the palette how opaque it's going to be on your paper. And while it's not the end of the world if it ends up being darker or lighter than you planned for, it is generally a good idea to test it out first instead of going straight in on your piece of artwork. I would also recommend having a towel or paper towel nearby in case you need to dab extra ink off of your work, because sometimes adding too much liquid at one time will cause bleeding throughout the paper and the ink will migrate further than you want it to. As for actually shading your work, I always start lighter than I need to. It's a lot easier to add pigment than it is to take it away, and ink dries pretty quickly, so it's not always a good idea to rely on your towel to take away that excess product unless you're really quick with it, and it will still leave a mark behind anyway. So being mindful of where you're putting it and always working from the lightest shade and just building up that coverage is really going to help. Ink layers really well, so you don't have to really worry about going heavy-handed right off the bat. And while some people are really good at being efficient and precise with heavier layers to start out with, I tend to prefer to go slow and just take my time with the art. Take it as an opportunity to really just lose yourself in the process. I also want to mention that you can use a lot of watercolor tips in this. You don't have to add ink to every portion of the drawing or like fill in every single piece of the subject that you see. You can leave some areas for the paper to shine through, and it can kind of give an effect of highlights without having to add a different ink or a different paint to do so. You still definitely can mix mediums if you want. I usually enjoy adding colored pencil to my ink drawings, and mixing textures and art mediums can really create an interesting visual piece. But if your goal is to create something with ink only, I would definitely rely on a lot of watercolor techniques. But of course, ultimately, art is what you make it. If you want to ignore everything that I've mentioned in this video and do your own thing, just throw caution to the wind and hope for the best, then go for it. There's a lot of really interesting artwork out there that has been made through experimentation with art mediums, so in reality, there aren't any rules, it's just guidelines if you want to replicate a style or an effect. It takes a lot of practice and repetition to grow into your own skill sets as an artist, and I would highly recommend learning foundational stuff first, just so that you have something to build off of to develop your own style. Don't be discouraged if you don't like what you've made, or if it's quote-unquote bad or doesn't turn out the way you expect it to. I didn't start making art like this right away. I made some pretty strange things for a long time before finding my niche and really learning what suited me best. And I'm bound to make more bad art in the future. Not every piece that I make is going to be a masterpiece, and neither will yours. The point is that you're trying and learning from them, and without mistakes, you never have an opportunity to grow. Alright, I think that is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if I glossed over anything or maybe forgot to mention something, feel free to ask questions in the comments below, and I will try and answer them the best that I can. As always, thank you so much for being here and watching until the end. Your time and your support is much appreciated, and I hope to see you in my next video. There's a lot of chill vlogs and some drawing process videos for you to catch up on, and many more to come. I will see you all very soon.